The most dangerous mistake a person in power can make is believing dignity depends on a uniform. The morning sun had barely climbed above the rooftops of Ashford, Georgia, casting long golden beams across Main Street as the town slowly came to life. Pickup trucks rolled past brick storefronts that had stood for generations. The local bakery filled the crisp autumn air with the smell of fresh biscuits, and neighbors greeted one another by first name, as if time itself had agreed to move a little slower here. It looked like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed the moment they arrived, and where the sheriff's badge carried nearly as much weight as the courthouse across the square. At the corner of Main and Willow sat Maggie's Family Diner, a small restaurant with faded red booths, polished chrome stools, and walls covered with decades of photographs celebrating Little League champions, military veterans, and 4th of July parades. Every morning before 7, farmers, mechanics, teachers, and retirees gathered over coffee that never seemed to stop flowing. Conversations drifted from high school football to crop prices, from church fundraisers to fishing trips on Lake Hartwell. It was the heartbeat of the town, a place where people believed ordinary mornings stayed ordinary. That belief was about to disappear. Seated alone near the front window was a well-dressed black man in his early 50s. His charcoal suit fit perfectly despite the long drive that had brought him into town before sunrise. A neatly folded newspaper rested beside his plate, and a leather portfolio leaned against the booth beside him. He moved with quiet confidence, thanking the waitress by name after reading her name tag, smiling politely whenever another customer glanced his way. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet there was something unmistakably composed about the way he carried himself, as though years of responsibility had taught him never to waste energy proving his worth to strangers. His name was Daniel Brooks, though no one inside the diner knew it. They certainly didn't know why he had come to Ashford without an escort, without flashing credentials, and without informing a single local official. He preferred it that way. Sometimes the only way to understand a community was to walk through it unnoticed. Daniel lifted his coffee, watching the steam curl into the morning light while listening to the ordinary conversations surrounding him. He noticed the waitress rushing between tables without complaint. He noticed the elderly veteran struggling to open a packet of sweetener before another customer quietly helped him. He noticed kindness expressed in simple gestures that never made headlines. Those moments reminded him why public service still mattered after all these years. Outside, however, another pair of eyes had settled on the diner. Sheriff Clayton Mercer climbed out of his patrol SUV, adjusting the polished campaign hat that had become his trademark throughout the county. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying himself with unquestioned authority, Mercer believed respect was something people owed the badge before they ever earned the man wearing it. Locals tipped their hats when he walked by. Business owners greeted him with practiced smiles. Few people challenged his judgment, and fewer still questioned his decisions. As he glanced through the diner window, his attention fixed immediately on the unfamiliar face sitting calmly by himself. The sheriff narrowed his eyes for only a second before stepping toward the entrance, convinced that breakfast was about to become an investigation, unaware that the quiet visitor he had already judged without a single conversation was one of the most powerful law enforcement leaders in the United States, and that within the next few minutes. One ordinary morning in Ashford would become the story the entire nation could not stop talking about. Sheriff Clayton Mercer pushed open the glass door, and the familiar bell above it announced his arrival before anyone needed to look up. Conversations softened almost instantly. A few customers offered polite nods while others lifted their coffee mugs in greeting. Maggie smiled from behind the register. "Morning, Sheriff." He answered with a brief nod, but his attention never left the unfamiliar man seated by the window. Daniel Brooks calmly folded another section of his newspaper before taking a sip of coffee, seemingly unaware that nearly every eye in the diner had begun shifting between the two men. Mercer walked slowly across the checkered floor, his boots producing steady, deliberate footsteps that echoed louder than usual in the quiet room. He stopped beside the booth without introducing himself. "I have not seen you around here before," he said in a measured but unmistakably authoritative voice. Daniel looked up with a courteous smile. "Good morning. That is because I'm just visiting." The answer was simple, respectful, and complete. Yet something about the calm confidence in Daniel's tone seemed to irritate the sheriff more than satisfy him. "Visiting from where?" Mercer continued. Daniel reached for his coffee before answering. "Washington, District of Columbia." Several customers exchanged curious glances. Washington sounded important, but the visitor did not look like someone trying to impress anyone. He had no security detail, no expensive watch displayed for attention, no obvious symbols of status. Just an ordinary traveler enjoying breakfast. Mercer folded his arms. "Business or personal?" Daniel answered with the same relaxed composure. "A little of both." The sheriff frowned. Vague answers never sat well with him, especially from someone he did not recognize. "You staying in town long?" Daniel smiled politely. "Only as long as necessary." The waitress approached with a fresh pot of coffee, sensing the growing tension. "Can I refill your cups, sir?" she asked Daniel. "Please, and thank you," he replied warmly before thanking her again as she filled the mug. The simple kindness stood in sharp contrast to the increasingly rigid conversation taking place only inches away. Mercer watched every movement carefully. In his mind, confidence without explanation was something to question, not admire. He glanced toward the leather portfolio resting beside the booth. "Mind telling me what is in the case?" Daniel rested one hand lightly beside it without appearing defensive. "Professional documents." "May I see them?" the sheriff asked. Daniel's expression remained calm. "I would prefer to finish breakfast first, if that is all right." The response was respectful, but it landed like a personal challenge. Around the diner, forks stopped halfway to plates. Coffee cups remained suspended in midair. Even the kitchen seemed quieter than moments before. Maggie looked toward one of her servers with visible concern, silently hoping the conversation would end before it spoiled the peaceful morning. Daniel, however, appeared completely at ease. He cut another piece of toast, spread a little butter across it, and continued eating with unhurried precision. Years of leadership had taught him that composure often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Mercer interpreted the same calm very differently. To him, it looked like quiet defiance. His jaw tightened slightly as he scanned Daniel once more, searching for something that justified the growing suspicion forming in his mind. What he failed to notice was that Daniel had quietly observed every reaction inside the diner from the moment the sheriff entered. The nervous glances, the uncomfortable silence, the way ordinary citizens immediately adjusted their behavior when authority stepped into the room. Daniel had seen these patterns before in communities across America, and each one told a story that official reports rarely captured. Outside, the town square continued waking beneath the gentle morning sun, completely unaware that inside Maggie's family diner, two very different ideas of authority had just begun a quiet collision that would soon test not only one sheriff's judgment, but the character of an entire community. The silence inside Maggie's family diner settled like a heavy morning fog. Nobody wanted to interrupt what was unfolding, yet nobody felt comfortable pretending it was not happening. Daniel Brooks carefully placed his fork beside his plate and reached for the white ceramic coffee mug, taking another slow sip before setting it down with deliberate care. His heartbeat never seemed to change. Years spent making difficult decisions under intense public pressure had taught him that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one with the greatest authority. Sheriff Clayton. Mercer remained standing beside the booth, his posture rigid, his expression fixed somewhere between confidence and irritation. He had expected hesitation. He had expected nervous explanations. Instead, he found himself facing a man whose calmness refused to crack. "You seem awfully comfortable for someone who cannot answer a few simple questions," Mercer finally said. Daniel looked directly at him, neither challenging nor avoiding his gaze. "I believe I have answered every question you asked." The sheriff shook his head slightly. "Not completely." Daniel nodded once. Sometimes complete answers require complete questions. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances. An elderly veteran sitting near the counter quietly lowered his newspaper. He had spent more than 30 years wearing the uniform of the United States Army, and something about the visitor reminded him of officers he had met during his service. Not because of expensive clothes or visible rank, but because of the discipline reflected in every movement. Daniel never rushed. He never raised his voice. He never allowed another person's emotions to dictate his own. Maggie stepped closer from behind the register, forcing a friendly smile. "Sheriff, can I bring you some coffee?" Mercer answered without looking away from Daniel. "Not right now." The waitress carrying fresh biscuits slowed as she passed the table, sensing that every word spoken had become important. Even the sounds from the kitchen faded as cooks quietly watched through the service window. Daniel reached into his jacket slowly enough that nobody could mistake the movement for anything sudden. He removed a business card and placed it neatly on the table without sliding it toward the sheriff. "If you would like to know my name," he said politely, "there it is." Mercer picked up the card with 2 fingers. The plain white cardstock displayed only a name, a Washington office address, and a government telephone number. There was no impressive title beneath the name. No seal. No attempt to advertise importance. The simplicity only deepened the sheriff's suspicion. "Anybody can print a card," Mercer replied. Daniel gave a small nod. "That is true." The answer frustrated the sheriff even more because it offered no argument to defeat. It simply acknowledged reality. Daniel had learned long ago that truth rarely needed decoration. Outside the front window, a black government sedan rolled quietly through the town square before continuing down the street. Daniel noticed it only for a moment before returning his attention to the conversation. Mercer never saw it at all. His focus remained fixed on proving that his instincts could not possibly be wrong. "I still think you should identify yourself properly," he insisted. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "There's a difference between refusing to cooperate and asking to be treated with ordinary respect. I came here for breakfast, not to become the center of attention." His words were calm, but they carried a quiet weight that lingered in the room long after he finished speaking. Several customers looked down at their plates, suddenly uncomfortable with how quickly an ordinary meal had turned into an examination of one man's right to simply exist in peace. The sheriff interpreted the statement as another challenge to his authority. Daniel intended it as something entirely different. To him, respect was never something granted by position alone. It was demonstrated through conduct. And before this morning was over, everyone inside Maggie's family diner would discover just how much that difference truly mattered. Sheriff Clayton Mercer let the business card rest in his palm for another moment before placing it back onto the table. The silence inside the diner had become almost unnatural. Even the coffee machine seemed louder than the conversations that had disappeared. Mercer leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel more personal than public. "You keep talking about respect, but you have not given me one good reason to stop asking questions." Daniel Brooks looked at the half-finished breakfast in front of him before meeting the sheriff's eyes once again. "Questions are never the problem," he answered quietly. "The assumptions behind them usually are." The words lingered in the air. A young father, sitting with his 2 children, shifted uncomfortably in his booth. His little boy looked toward the sheriff with innocent curiosity before whispering, "Dad, is that man in trouble?" The father hesitated for several seconds before quietly answering, "I do not know." Daniel heard the exchange without reacting. If anything, his expression softened for the briefest moment. Children often notice things adults had learned to ignore. Mercer straightened his shoulders. "This town is my responsibility. When I see someone I do not recognize carrying government documents and refusing to identify himself, I investigate. That is my job." Daniel nodded with genuine understanding. "Protecting your community is an honorable responsibility. It deserves professionalism, fairness, and patience every single time." The sheriff frowned. "Are you suggesting I am not being professional?" Daniel chose his words carefully. "I am suggesting that every citizen deserves the same benefit of the doubt before conclusions are reached." Around the diner, several customers quietly lowered their eyes. The elderly veteran folded his newspaper completely and rested both hands on the table. He remembered hearing nearly identical words decades earlier from a commanding officer who believed that leadership began with listening before judging. Maggie wiped an already clean section of the counter simply to occupy her nervous hands. She had known Sheriff Mercer for years. He could be helpful during storms, generous during charity events, and dependable when emergencies happened. Yet she also knew there were mornings when pride spoke louder than wisdom. Daniel remained remarkably composed. He checked the simple wristwatch beneath his cuff, not out of impatience, but because time mattered today. Somewhere across town, people were preparing for meetings they did not yet realize would begin differently than planned. His visit had never been announced because he wanted to observe the town exactly as it functioned on an ordinary morning. The unexpected encounter unfolding inside the diner had already revealed more than any prepared briefing ever could. Mercer noticed the glance at the watch. "In a hurry?" he asked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Only. Mindful that everyone has responsibilities waiting." "Including you?" the sheriff pressed. "Including me." The answer was brief, steady, and impossible to read. Outside, another government vehicle quietly entered Main Street before parking nearly half a block away. Two professionally dressed men stepped onto the sidewalk without attracting attention. They did not rush. They simply surveyed the area with practiced calm before beginning a measured walk toward the diner. Inside, nobody noticed them through the reflections on the front windows. Mercer continued focusing entirely on the man seated before him, convinced that persistence would eventually expose whatever secret he believed was being hidden. Daniel, however, had already recognized the subtle timing. He knew exactly who had arrived, and he knew they would not interrupt unless absolutely necessary. That confidence came from years of working with people who understood discipline better than urgency. The room remained suspended between ordinary routine and something none of the customers could yet explain. Every passing second seemed to stretch a little longer, as though the quiet little diner itself understood that one conversation, built entirely on assumptions and restraint, was about to change the way everyone inside remembered this morning for the rest of their lives. The front door opened with its familiar chime, but this time almost nobody turned to look. Everyone remained focused on the quiet exchange taking place near the window booth. The two professionally dressed men who entered carried themselves with the understated confidence of people accustomed to serious responsibility. Dark suits, polished shoes, discreet earpieces hidden beneath neatly trimmed hair, and calm expressions that revealed nothing. They paused just inside the entrance, scanning the room with practiced precision before their eyes settled on Daniel Brooks. Neither man appeared alarmed. Instead, they exchanged a subtle glance, silently confirming what they already suspected. Daniel gave the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, signaling them to remain where they were. They obeyed immediately without speaking a single word. "Sheriff." Clayton Mercer noticed the movement from the corner of his eye. He turned toward the newcomers, studying them carefully before looking back at Daniel. "Friends of yours?" he asked. Daniel answered honestly. "Colleagues." Mercer crossed his arms once more. "Interesting timing." Daniel simply smiled. Sometimes schedules overlap. The sheriff's attention shifted toward the two men again. They stood patiently near the entrance without interfering, without demanding attention, and without displaying badges or credentials. Their restraint only deepened the mystery. Maggie recognized that something unusual was unfolding. She had served enough travelers over the years to recognize business executives, military officers, and government employees. These men did not resemble tourists or sales representatives. They looked like professionals trained to observe first and speak later. Daniel reached for his coffee again, only to discover the mug was nearly empty. Before he could ask, the waitress quietly stepped forward with a fresh pot. "May I refill it?" she asked. "Thank you," Daniel replied with genuine appreciation. "You have been very kind this morning." The waitress smiled nervously. "Just trying to make sure everyone has what they need." Daniel looked at her warmly. Kindness is never a small thing. Those words reached farther across the diner than anyone expected. Even customers who had remained silent throughout the morning found themselves reflecting on them. Mercer, however, remained unconvinced. To him, every calm answer felt like another carefully constructed wall. "You still have not explained why government personnel are showing up at a small diner in my town," he said. Daniel rested both hands calmly on the edge of the table. "Because they were instructed to meet me after breakfast." "By whom?" Mercer asked immediately. Daniel answered without hesitation. "By me." The simplicity of the statement briefly caught the sheriff off guard. There was no arrogance in Daniel's voice, no attempt to impress the room. He spoke with the quiet certainty of someone describing an ordinary part of his day. Mercer narrowed his eyes. "That sounds like a very important position." Daniel paused for only a second. Every public servant has an important position if they remember who they serve. The answer frustrated the sheriff because it revealed nothing while somehow saying everything. Outside, another vehicle turned slowly into the town square, this one displaying discreet federal government plates that only trained observers would recognize. The driver remained inside without approaching the diner. Inside, one of the suited men quietly checked his watch before glancing toward Daniel again. They were clearly waiting for his signal rather than acting on their own authority. Daniel understood exactly why. His visit had been intentionally low profile. There had been no advance announcements, no local escort, and no ceremonial welcome because he wanted to witness ordinary interactions exactly as they happened. The morning had already produced more insight than weeks of written reports could have delivered. Across the room, the elderly veteran leaned toward the young father sitting nearby and whispered softly, "I spent decades around federal officials. That gentleman does not carry himself like someone pretending." The father followed Daniel with thoughtful eyes, beginning to question assumptions he had accepted only minutes earlier. The atmosphere inside Maggie's family diner had shifted again. What began as curiosity had slowly transformed into uncertainty, and uncertainty was quietly making room for something much larger. The truth had not yet been spoken aloud, but its presence could already be felt by everyone willing to pay close enough attention. Daniel Brooks glanced once more toward the two men waiting patiently near the entrance before returning his attention to the sheriff. The room remained remarkably still, as though every person inside the diner instinctively understood that whatever happened next would matter long after breakfast plates had been cleared away. Sheriff Clayton Mercer took one slow breath and extended his hand toward the leather portfolio resting beside Daniel. "I'm asking one last time. I would like to inspect those documents." Daniel rested his hand lightly on the portfolio, not possessively, simply acknowledging its presence. "Sheriff, those materials contain sensitive government information. They are not public records, and I am not authorized to display them in a crowded restaurant." Mercer frowned. "You expect me to accept that answer?" Daniel replied with the same measured tone he had maintained all morning. "I expect you to understand that public trust includes respecting legal boundaries, even when curiosity makes that difficult." The words landed with unexpected weight. The elderly veteran slowly nodded to himself. He remembered countless briefings where officers had been reminded that authority without restraint quickly became something else entirely. Across the room, Maggie quietly refilled another customer's coffee, but her attention never drifted far from the conversation. She could feel the tension spreading through the diner like an approaching thunderstorm that produced no wind, only silence. Mercer reached into his pocket and removed a small notepad. "Then let us start with something simple. Full name: Daniel Brooks. Occupation." Daniel paused briefly before answering. "Federal Public Service." The sheriff looked up immediately. "Doing what?" Daniel smiled politely. "Serving the Constitution to the best of my ability." Mercer lowered the pen with visible frustration. "You answer every question without actually answering it." Daniel's expression remained thoughtful rather than defensive. Sometimes titles influence judgment before character has a chance to speak for itself. Several customers exchanged quiet looks. That sentence seemed directed at everyone in the room, not only the sheriff. Outside, another federal vehicle rolled slowly past the diner before continuing toward the courthouse. Nothing about the movement appeared hurried. It was almost as though every arrival had been carefully timed to avoid unnecessary attention. One of the suited men near the entrance discreetly touched his wristwatch before receiving a brief vibration. He read a message without removing his phone from his jacket. His posture remained composed, but his eyes lifted toward Daniel with silent confirmation. Everything was proceeding exactly according to schedule. Daniel noticed the subtle signal and understood its meaning immediately. The meeting at the courthouse had officially begun without him. That alone would surprise many people. Yet those who worked closest with him understood his philosophy. No meeting was more important than understanding the people affected by the decisions made inside it. Mercer mistook Daniel's brief glance toward the entrance for distraction. "Expecting someone important?" he asked. Daniel answered honestly. "They have already arrived." The sheriff followed Daniel's eyes toward the two waiting men. "Then perhaps they can explain who you really are." Before either man could move, Daniel gave another almost invisible shake of his head. They remained exactly where they stood. Their discipline seemed unusual to everyone watching. Whoever Daniel was, these men clearly accepted direction from him without hesitation. Maggie slowly stepped closer to the booth. "Gentlemen," she said softly, hoping to ease the growing tension, "your breakfast is getting cold." Daniel looked up at her with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for reminding us that ordinary moments deserve attention too." Mercer remained standing. His confidence had not disappeared, but something new had entered his expression. For the first time that morning, certainty had begun giving way to doubt. Every answer Daniel provided created more questions than the last, and every passing minute made the quiet visitor seem less like a suspicious stranger and more like someone carrying responsibilities far beyond anything the sheriff had first imagined. The truth was no longer hidden behind mystery alone. It was patiently waiting for the exact moment when assumptions would finally collide with reality. Daniel Brooks allowed the silence to settle before reaching into the inside pocket of his suit jacket once again. This time, however, his movement carried a quiet sense of purpose rather than simple courtesy. Every eye inside Maggie's family diner followed his hand. Sheriff Clayton Mercer remained perfectly still, watching with cautious concentration. Daniel removed a slim black leather credential holder and placed it carefully on the table without opening it. He looked at the sheriff before speaking. "Sheriff Mercer, I have tried to preserve the ordinary nature of this morning because that was the purpose of my visit. I wanted to see this town exactly as it is when nobody believes they are being observed." Mercer looked down at the credential holder but made no move toward it. "Then why carry identification if you have no intention of showing it?" Daniel answered calmly. "Because identification should clarify a situation, not define the value of a person." Those words seemed to stop the room even more completely than the silence before them. The elderly veteran slowly removed his glasses, studying Daniel with growing recognition. The confidence, the restraint, the refusal to rely on titles. It reminded him of senior leaders he had respected throughout his military career. Daniel gently opened the leather holder and turned it toward the sheriff. Inside rested a federal identification card beneath the unmistakable seal of the United States government. Mercer leaned forward, reading the name once more before his eyes dropped to the title beneath it. His expression changed almost immediately. The certainty that had carried him through the entire morning disappeared, replaced first by confusion, then disbelief. He read the title again, as though expecting the words to rearrange themselves. Director, Federal Bureau of Investigation. For several long seconds, the sheriff simply stared. Nobody inside the diner spoke. Maggie covered her mouth with one hand. The waitress froze beside the coffee station. Even the young children sensed that something extraordinary had just happened without fully understanding why. Mercer slowly lifted his eyes toward Daniel, searching for any sign that the identification might be false. Instead, he found only the same calm expression that had never changed from the moment he entered the diner. Before the sheriff could speak, the two suited men near the entrance stepped forward in perfect coordination. One of them removed his own credentials and presented them respectfully. "Special Agent Michael Hayes," he said evenly. The second man followed. Special Agent Rebecca Collins, Protective Operations Division. Neither agent raised a voice. Neither displayed intimidation. They simply confirmed what the room had already begun to realize. Daniel had never exaggerated his importance because he had never needed to. Mercer instinctively looked back toward Daniel. "You are the director?" His voice sounded quieter now, almost uncertain. Daniel closed the credential holder and placed it back into his jacket. "Yes." Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No lecture. No celebration of being right. Just one simple word. The simplicity somehow carried greater weight than any lengthy explanation ever could. Outside the diner, several additional federal vehicles came to a discreet stop along the curb. No emergency lights flashed. No crowd gathered. Professional men and women remained beside their vehicles, waiting patiently because their instructions had always been clear. Do not interrupt unless the director requests assistance. Inside, Daniel looked around the diner at every face watching him. "I asked my team not to announce my arrival because titles often change how people behave. Character rarely does." His eyes returned to Sheriff Mercer, not with anger or satisfaction, but with quiet disappointment. This morning was never about testing security procedures. It was about understanding whether every citizen receives the same measure of dignity before assumptions take their place. The words settled over the diner with undeniable force. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody whispered. In that single moment, the small restaurant became something much larger than a place serving breakfast. It became a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths that no badge, title, or position could hide for several long moments. Sheriff Clayton Mercer could not find the words that had come so easily only minutes before. The confidence that had filled every question now gave way to careful silence. He looked around the diner and realized that every face was watching, not because they wanted humiliation, but because they were trying to understand how an ordinary breakfast had become an extraordinary lesson. Daniel Brooks reached for his coffee once more, discovering that it had grown cold. Maggie quietly stepped forward with a fresh pot in her trembling hands. "May I bring you another cup?" she asked softly. Daniel smiled with the same warmth he had shown from the beginning. "I would appreciate that very much. Thank you." She poured the coffee carefully, her hands steadier than before, though the emotion in her eyes remained visible. "I had no idea who you were," she admitted. Daniel looked at her kindly. "You treated me with respect before you knew. That is what matters." Maggie lowered her eyes for a moment, visibly relieved. Across the room, the elderly veteran slowly rose from his booth. He removed his cap and held it respectfully against his chest. "Sir," he said, "I served this country for 32 years. I have met many people with impressive titles. Very few carry them as quietly as you do." Daniel stood as well and extended his hand. "Then we have both spent our lives serving something larger than ourselves." The veteran accepted the handshake with quiet pride, and several customers nodded without saying a word. Sheriff Mercer finally cleared his throat. "Director Brooks," he began carefully, The sentence stopped before it could continue. Daniel waited patiently, never attempting to rescue him from the uncomfortable silence. Some moments deserved honesty more than convenience. After another breath, Mercer continued. "I made assumptions before I knew the facts." Daniel answered gently. "That is something every public servant must guard against, including me." The sheriff looked surprised by the response. "Including you?" Daniel nodded. "Authority does not make any of us immune from mistakes. It simply gives our mistakes greater consequences." Those words settled heavily over the room. They did not sound like criticism. They sounded like experience earned over decades. One of the federal agents stepped forward just enough to quietly inform Daniel. "Director, the courthouse meeting has been delayed until your arrival." Daniel acknowledged him with a simple nod. "Please thank everyone for their patience." The agent immediately stepped back. Mercer noticed the exchange. "They delayed the meeting." Daniel smiled faintly. "Leadership is not measured by arriving first. It is measured by arriving with a right understanding." The sheriff lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Daniel. Was this visit planned to evaluate our department? Daniel considered the question carefully. The purpose of my visit was broader than that. I wanted to observe how public trust lives in ordinary places. Reports describe policies. Communities reveal character. A quiet silence followed. The young father who had earlier struggled to answer his son's question placed one hand on the boy's shoulder. "Remember this morning," he whispered. "Never decide who someone is before you know them." The child nodded with the simple sincerity only children possess. Daniel picked up the check that Maggie had quietly placed beside his plate. Before she could object, he handed her his payment along with a generous tip. "Breakfast was excellent," he said sincerely. "Hospitality like yours strengthens a town more than people realize." Maggie smiled through grateful eyes. "Thank you, sir." Daniel gathered his portfolio and adjusted his jacket. Nothing about his movements suggested victory. Nothing suggested resentment. He carried himself exactly as he had when he first walked through the door that morning. The only thing that had changed was the understanding of everyone around him. They no longer saw an unfamiliar traveler sitting alone over breakfast. They saw a man who had quietly demonstrated that the strongest form of authority never demanded respect through fear, only through unwavering character, patient restraint, and the courage to let truth reveal itself in its own time. Daniel Brooks stepped toward the entrance. But before his hand reached the door, he paused and looked back across Maggie's family diner one final time. The room was no longer frozen in uncertainty. Instead, it had settled into thoughtful silence, the kind that followed a lesson nobody expected to learn. Morning sunlight poured through the front windows, stretching across the polished floor exactly as it had when he first arrived, yet somehow everything felt different. Sheriff Clayton Mercer slowly removed his campaign hat and held it respectfully at his side. The gesture was small, but everyone in the diner understood its meaning. It was no longer directed toward title. It was directed toward a man whose conduct had exposed the difference between authority and integrity. "Director Brooks," Mercer said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Daniel stopped and turned toward him. His expression remained calm. "You do not owe me perfect judgment, Sheriff. None of us possesses that. What we owe one another is the willingness to correct ourselves when the truth becomes clear." Mercer nodded slowly. "I should have listened before I assumed. I allowed appearances to guide questions that should have been guided by facts." Daniel walked back a few steps until they stood only a short distance apart. Every community places enormous trust in the people who wear a badge. That trust grows stronger every time respect comes before suspicion and fairness comes before conclusions. The sheriff lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "I understand that now." Daniel smiled gently. "Then this morning has already accomplished something worthwhile." The elderly veteran looked around the diner and quietly said, "Sometimes the most important victories happen when nobody loses their dignity." Several customers nodded in agreement. Even the young boy who had spent the morning watching from his booth seemed to understand that something meaningful had taken place. He tugged lightly on his father's sleeve. "Dad, was that man always important?" His father smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Yes, but not because of his job, because of how he treated people before anyone knew who he was." Daniel heard the exchange and gave the boy a warm smile. "That is something worth remembering." Outside, the waiting federal personnel remained exactly where they were, allowing the moment inside the diner to conclude naturally. No cameras appeared. No speeches were prepared. No headlines had yet been written. The quiet truth of the morning belonged first to the people who had witnessed it with their own eyes. Maggie walked around the counter, holding a small paper bag. "Sir," she said with a smile, "I pack you a slice of our pecan pie for the road. It is our way of thanking guests." Daniel accepted it with genuine appreciation. "Then I will remember Ashford for its kindness." Maggie laughed softly. "I hope you remember us for learning something too." Daniel nodded. Communities are not defined by moments of imperfection. They're defined by what they choose to become afterward. Sheriff Mercer extended his hand. This time there was no hesitation, no authority to prove, and no audience to impress. Daniel accepted the handshake firmly. It lasted only a moment, yet it carried the weight of mutual understanding rather than obligation. As Daniel finally stepped through the front door, the crisp Georgia air greeted him once again. The federal agents quietly fell into step several paces behind him without drawing attention. Across the town square, ordinary life resumed. Shop doors opened. School buses passed. Church bells echoed faintly in the distance. To anyone arriving late, it looked like nothing unusual had happened at all. But inside Maggie's family diner, every person carried home a different understanding of justice, respect, and character. They had learned that real leadership never needed to announce itself before breakfast, and that the truest measure of a person could never be found in the color of their skin, the clothes they wore, or the title printed on an identification card. It could only be found in the quiet choices they made when nobody believed the world was watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.